Hi everyone, my name is Apuraj Garakapati. Welcome to my YouTube channel Amazing Abhay. Brain on Theo's body. Even Griffin admitted Theo had finally used his brain for once. While the fairy dragon praised the clever solution, with Balmung acting as the perfect conduit, Theo gradually absorbed the entirety of Leviathan's remaining power. When the process finally ended, unimaginable mana surged through every fiber of his being. It felt as though the sea dragon itself now lived inside him. The fairy dragon quickly reminded him that celebration could wait. The floating archipelago was still falling, wielding Leviathan's power at its peak. Theo commanded the ocean currents to obey his will. The wild mana beneath the sea instantly calmed, as colossal currents lifted the entire floating archipelago into the sky. Theo had already decided where its new home would be. There was only one destination worthy of protecting the islands, and he was determined to carry them there with his own power. The floating archipelago was finally returning to where it truly belonged. The northeastern region of Ragnar, the land it had once occupied long ago. Wielding the Leviathan's immense power alongside Balmung, Theo bent the ocean itself to his will. Massive currents answered his command as if the sea had become his personal servant. Above the waves, the fierce battle outside Kremihild's temple was still raging. The Three Clans army and the Black Skull resistance continued clashing without mercy, and innocent civilians remained trapped between both sides. Then everything changed. Gigantic tidal waves suddenly surged across the coastline, forcing every soldier to stop fighting. Panic spread instantly as everyone believed the floating archipelago was finally sinking. Citizens, soldiers, and priests alike looked toward the temple, praying that the hero they had placed all their hopes in would save them. Fear united every faction for the first time, but instead of being swallowed by the sea, one observant soldier noticed something impossible. The coastline wasn't falling. It was moving, guided by enormous waves. The entire floating archipelago, complete with its mountains, cities, forests, and countless islands, slowly drifted away from its original location toward Ragnar's northeastern frontier. Far away, inside the crumbling sanctuary where Newell and Barian had been discussing their schemes, the violent movement beneath their feet immediately interrupted their conversation. Cracks spread across the old structure as the entire island shifted through the ocean. Newell's expression darkened. He instantly realized that the outsider had successfully claimed the dragon-slaying sword's true power. Theo Ragnar had accomplished the impossible. Meanwhile, Barian simply kept wearing his carefree grin despite the chaos around them. He casually apologized for ending their meeting early, pointing out that staying inside a collapsing building wasn't exactly a smart idea. Newell, however, wasn't ready to let things go. He was still furious over Barian's suspicious lack of involvement and accused him of deliberately withholding information. Barian calmly admitted that even he hadn't predicted Theo's actions. Still, instead of treating the situation as a disaster, he viewed it as an opportunity. Theo had already awakened Balmung for them. Now all they had to do was eliminate Theo and take the fully activated relic for themselves. In reality, Barian was cleverly trying to use Troyavan's strength to remove one of his greatest political rivals without dirtying his own hands. Ignoring Newell's endless complaints, he simply urged the ninth vessel to stop wasting time and get to work, claiming the current situation could actually become immensely profitable for Troyavan. Back on the battlefield, Antonio Spinola immediately understood what had happened the moment the islands began moving. Theo had actually fulfilled the unbelievable promise he made before arriving. Relief washed over Antonio as he realized the floating archipelago and everyone living on it had been saved. There was no longer any reason for more bloodshed. Without hesitation, he ordered every Black Skull soldier to cease fighting. The resistance obeyed, believing the conflict had finally reached its conclusion. Unfortunately, not everyone shared Antonio's desire for peace. The instant he lowered his guard, one of the enemy soldiers exploited the opening and launched a surprise attack from behind, aiming directly for Antonio's neck. Before the blade could reach him, Theo burst onto the battlefield like a flash of lightning. His timing couldn't have been more perfect. With one effortless swing of Balmung, he intercepted the ambush and sliced the would-be assassin cleanly in half. The believers watching the scene erupted with joy, convinced they had just witnessed Kriemhild herself returning to protect her people once again. Antonio looked toward Theo with genuine gratitude and immediately asked the question weighing on everyone's mind. Was it really over? Were the floating archipelago and its people finally safe? Theo calmly confirmed that the immediate crisis had been resolved. Hearing those words, Antonio felt years of anxiety melt away from his shoulders. He sincerely thanked Theo for saving not only the islands, but everyone living on them. Then, with absolutely zero shame, he prepared to ask for one final favor. Theo didn't even let him finish. One glance across the battlefield told him everything he needed to know. Corpses of innocent civilians lay scattered across the sacred grounds, while countless wounded survivors desperately clung to life. The Black Skull Resistance and ordinary citizens had risked everything to protect both their homeland and the man they believed was their savior. Theo decided the debt deserved repayment. As Theo began walking toward the remaining 3 clan soldiers, panic instantly spread through their ranks. Many seriously considered dropping their weapons and surrendering on the spot. Standing against someone who had just moved an entire archipelago felt utterly hopeless. Their commander, Umberto Spinel, saw things differently. To him, Theo wasn't an unstoppable monster. He was simply a walking prize, carrying the legendary dragon-slaying sword. Consumed by greed, Umberto screamed at his men to stop hesitating and seize Balmung before the opportunity disappeared. Terrified of their own patriarch, the soldier reluctantly obeyed, despite knowing the odds were stacked against them. One by one, they charged directly toward Theo, hoping overwhelming numbers might accomplish what courage couldn't. Before anyone could even reach him, an overwhelming wave of killing intent suddenly swallowed the battlefield. The air itself became suffocating. Theo's instincts screamed in, warning the instant the newcomer arrived. Without even identifying the attacker, he immediately shouted for everyone nearby, friend and enemy alike, to throw themselves flat onto the ground. Those who trusted his warning reacted instantly, diving face first onto the bridge without understanding why. Others hesitated for only a fraction of a second. That tiny delay sealed their fate. A single sword slash cut across the bridge and one impossibly clean line. Time itself seemed to freeze as the attack passed. First, the bridge's railings were sliced apart with surgical precision. Then every soldier who remained standing lost the upper half of their heads before they even realized what had happened. The massacre lasted only a heartbeat. Bodies collapsed across the battlefield, while crimson blood painted the bridge an even darker shade than before. Those lying behind Theo survived solely because they obeyed his command. As stunned silence consumed the battlefield, everyone finally saw the man responsible. Standing amidst the aftermath was Noel, the 9th vassal of the Trovan clan. To him, the countless deaths meant absolutely nothing. He looked upon the slaughter with complete indifference before cursing the 3 clans for their utter incompetence. In his eyes, they were nothing more than worthless pirate dogs who had failed to eliminate a single troublesome brat. Because of their weakness, the entire situation had spiraled completely out of control. With Noel's arrival, everyone present immediately understood one terrifying truth. The real battle for the floating archipelago had only just begun. Among the countless victims of Noel's terrifying attack was Umberto Spinola himself, just like every other unfortunate soul standing on the bridge. The old patriarch had his head cleanly split apart before he even realized death had arrived. Ironically, his famous mustache remained perfectly intact. Antonio had spent years hating his father with every fiber of his being for selling out the floating archipelago and sacrificing innocent lives for his own survival. Yet, when he actually saw the old man's lifeless body lying among the dead, a wave of dread still washed over him. Before grief could consume him, Theo snapped him back to reality. There would be time to mourn later. Right now, Antonio was still the leader of Black Skull, and the floating archipelago would need him more than ever if it was going to rebuild after today's disaster. Swallowing his emotions, Antonio immediately began organizing the evacuation, while the surviving civilians rushed toward Kriemhild's temple for safety. Meanwhile, instead of retreating alongside everyone else, Theo calmly remained where he stood, staring directly at the monster responsible for the massacre. Noel slowly advanced, every step radiating overwhelming killing intent. His blood-red aura stained the battlefield with suffocating pressure. As his irritation toward House Ragnar reached its peak, The ninth vessel had grown tired of Theo constantly interfering with Troivin's grand designs. He wanted nothing more than to carve the arrogant successor into tiny pieces until even Theo Ragnar wouldn't be able to recognize what remained of his bastard son. Theo gritted his teeth while evaluating the overwhelming pressure. Judging from Noel's sheer strength, there was only one explanation. Troivin had already completed one of its noble servitors, artificially enhanced warriors, created specifically to rival Ragnar's legendary 9 dragons. During the Great War, these monsters have fought on equal footing with, or even surpassed, the 9 dragons themselves. Theo never imagined Troivin had already finished developing them this early in history. Before he could process the implications, another invisible sword screamed toward him. He barely twisted out of the way in time. There was no longer any room to think. Noel had already forced the battle upon him. The noble servitor demonstrated terrifying speed by instantly. Before we move ahead, please take a second to like on this video. A like tells me that you enjoyed this topic. Your support helps Amazing Apai grow naturally. Appearing high above Theo, before crashing down with a devastating strike. Every movement carried monstrous strength, capable of slicing through virtually anything. Theo quickly realized that Noel wasn't simply faster than anyone he'd fought before. His raw power completely eclipsed everything the young lord had experienced. Even wielding Balmung, Theo couldn't honestly say he had a chance of winning this fight. The moment Noel entered striking distance, Theo barely managed to raise the dragon's land sword in time. The collision launched him backward across the battlefield, as pain shot through both arms. Even that single probing strike nearly shattered his defense. Noel seemed mildly impressed that Theo could withstand so much force despite his current level, concluding that Balmung's power must be responsible. Refusing to ease up, Noel relentlessly continued his assault, denying Theo even a second to breathe. Troivin's research claimed that anyone carrying dragon blood should be incapable of even holding Balmung. Yet Theo continued, contradicting everything they believed. Noel didn't particularly care why, it simply meant the boy needed to die even more urgently. After driving Theo backward with continuous attacks, Noel paused long enough to mockingly suggest that the young lord surrender before things became even more painful. Theo answered with actions instead of words. Taking advantage of the lingering dust cloud, he launched several thunder-infused blades toward the servitor. Noel effortlessly caught every projectile in mid-air, scoffing at such childish tricks. What he didn't realize was that the blades had merely been bait. Theo had already used the distraction to close the distance himself. Unfortunately, Noel's perception was just as terrifying as his strength. The instant their eyes met, every alarm inside Theo screamed danger. Before Balmung could complete its swing toward Noel's flank, the servitor struck first, knocking Theo violently into the ground. At that moment, Noel finally understood why Troivin had personally warned every noble servitor about Theo Ragnar. Among Ragnar's younger generation, Ed considered Theo the greatest long-term threat. His orders had been crystal clear: if any servitor ever encountered Theo, the boy had to be executed immediately. Noel fully intended to fulfill that command today. After clearing the battlefield with another enormous circular slash, he discovered Theo had vanished. Only blood dripping from his blade proved the attack had connected. Hidden nearby, Theo desperately clutched the deep wound while attempting to activate Fairy's blessing. Unfortunately, his guardian still needed another 2 minutes and 15 seconds before Balmung would completely stabilize and allow Leviathan's power to awaken again. Knowing Theo was trying to stall, Noel refused to give him even a moment of peace. He relentlessly hunted him across the harbor, reducing centuries-old buildings to rubble with every casual swing. Theo barely survived by relying on pure reflexes, suffering several additional injuries that only worsened his blood loss. Again and again, Noel's crimson aura blades carved apart the port while Theo twisted, ducked, and narrowly escaped death by inches. During one exchange, Theo dashed through a collapsing building, grabbing an ordinary chair before tossing it at Noel as a cover. He poured massive amounts of mana into Balmung before unleashing an enormous sword attack, capable of tearing through everything in its path. Unfortunately, once the smoke settled, Noel remained standing completely unharmed. His glowing crimson blade cut through Theo's hopes just as easily as it had sliced apart the harbor. The servitor suddenly vanished before reappearing overhead, unleashing a relentless barrage that forced Theo onto pure defense. every block still sent him skipping across the ocean like a stone. Even after crashing into the water, Noil followed, immediately raining countless aura blades that blanketed the entire sea. Miraculously, Theo managed to avoid every strike beneath the surface, resurfacing moments later without fresh wounds. Exhausted and barely standing, he glanced at the system timer. Only 17 seconds remained. Noil had grown thoroughly irritated with Theo's constant, evasive tactics. Deciding to finish everything with overwhelming force, he began gathering an enormous amount of energy into his blade. Theo desperately searched for one final method to buy those remaining seconds. Then inspiration struck. If Noil's true mission was retrieving Balmung, why not use the sword itself as bait? Without hesitation, Theo hurled the dragon's laying sword across the battlefield. As expected, Noil immediately chased after it. Before the servitor could reach the weapon, Theo's newly contracted sea serpents surged from the ocean and caught Balmung in their jaws. Noil's face twisted with visible frustration. Behind Theo, the rest of the sea serpent pack emerged from the waves, every creature prepared to fight for their new master. Simultaneously, enormous spheres of compressed water gathered inside their mouths, before firing together in a devastating combined attack. Individually, each blast meant little to someone like Noil, but together, they demanded his full attention. With one overwhelming slash, he erased the attack entirely. Yet while he was occupied, Theo had already begun charging directly toward him. Confused by the sudden reckless assault, Noil welcomed the challenge. At that exact instant, Balmung's stabilization timer reached 0. Time itself seemed to pause. Leviathan's voice echoed inside Theo's mind, thanking the Chosen One, and wishing that the remaining fragments of his strength would forever protect him. In that instant, Theo unlocked Balmung's embedded ability, Nebelung. A colossal dragon form from Leviathan's overwhelming power erupted from the blade, taking the shape of the ancient guardian itself. For the first time since the battle began, genuine fear crossed Noil's face. The enormous dragon smashed through both Noil and his weapon, crushing him beneath the unbearable pressure of the ocean depths, before blasting him hundreds of meters away into open water. Theo's entire strategy had finally paid off. After surviving long enough to awaken Balmung's true ability, he had turned the tide completely. Nebelung shattered Noil's bones and inflicted catastrophic injuries, but Theo never fooled himself into believing a noble servitor would die that easily. Sure enough, moments later, Noil resurfaced, battered, but still alive. His mask had been obliterated, revealing a horrifying face twisted by years of grotesque human experimentation. Laughing through blood, he mocked Theo for failing to kill him with his greatest trump card. Theo calmly acknowledged the obvious. Noble servitors were infamous for their absurd durability. He never expected a single attack to finish one. Instead, he raised Balmung once more, and used Leviathan's authority over the seat itself. Massive currents gathered behind Noil, forming an enormous watery hand, capable of crushing even monsters. If raw power couldn't destroy the servitor's enhanced body, then the ocean itself would become his prison. Water surged from every direction, completely immobilizing Noil. As Theo expanded the crushing, before we move ahead, please take a second to share on this video. Sharing helps this video reach friends who may also enjoy anime, gaming, travel, cricket, chess, career basics, or personal stories. Your support helps Amazing Up grow naturally. Currents until they surrounded the entire floating archipelago. With one final command, the gigantic hand dragged Noil downward while an enormous vortex swallowed him whole. Realizing escape was impossible, the servitor could only watch as the crushing currents buried him beneath the endless abyss. Once Noil's presence finally disappeared into the depths, Theo's body gave out. Every injury he had ignored erupted in unbearable pain. His legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed onto his back, gasping for breath. Despite the agony, he smiled faintly. He had fulfilled the final promise he made to Leviathan, though after everything that giant dragon had asked him to do today, Theo sincerely hoped there wouldn't be one more favor waiting around the corner. After surviving an all-out battle against one of Troyven's 9 noble servitors, Theo barely had time to catch his breath before tackling an even more ridiculous task, guiding an entire floating nation across the sea. High above the coastline, Antonio Spinola carefully observed their course, acting as the archipelago's navigator, while calculating every possible variable. According to his estimates, the enormous landmass was drifting at roughly 2 knots, a slow enough speed that reaching the northeastern shores of Ragnar wouldn't trigger any catastrophic collision. Even so, Antonio still found the sight almost impossible to believe. Only a few days earlier, Theo had confidently claimed he intended to move the entire floating archipelago. Back then, Antonio had dismissed it as an impossible fantasy, yet now he was literally watching mountains, cities, forests, and countless islands glide peacefully across the ocean under Theo's control. Reality had become far stranger than imagination. As the islands slowly approached their new home, many citizens couldn't help questioning Theo's decision. According to the legends passed down for generations, simply restoring the dragon-slaying sword and resealing the sea dragon should have been enough to save the archipelago. Why go through the unimaginable effort of relocating an entire country? Theo admitted that, under normal circumstances, they were absolutely right. But today's invasion had proven exactly why the old solution was no longer enough. As long as the archipelago remained isolated and dependent on Balmung to stay afloat, ambitious people like the Troivans would continue invading in hopes of stealing the relic. Every future generation would be forced to relive the same nightmare. Theo explained that lasting peace sometimes demanded painful change. By permanently settling the islands within the shallow northeastern Bay of Ragnar's territory, the risk of the archipelago ever sinking again would disappear forever. Their homeland would no longer drift helplessly across the ocean, making many citizens jokingly wonder whether they would eventually need a brand new name, since it technically wouldn't be a floating archipelago anymore. Watching Theo devote himself entirely to protecting complete strangers left Antonio overwhelmed with guilt, unable to keep the burden to himself any longer. He lowered his head before the young lord and confessed everything. It was Black Skull that had orchestrated the Sarah's Merchant Guild hostage incident months earlier, even though the organization had only acted after being threatened by Troivan. The white-armored dragon cavalry still suffered terrible losses because of it. Antonio accepted full responsibility for the tragedy and admitted he deserved whatever punishment Theo chose. To him, execution would have been perfectly fair. He was fully prepared to pay with his life, if that was what justice demanded. Theo quietly listened before placing a reassuring hand on Antonio's shoulder. He agreed that responsibility had to be taken, but not in the way Antonio expected. Rather than condemning him, Theo shocked everyone by offering Antonio an entirely different future. Instead of losing his head, Antonio would become the leader of the newly established Northern Maritime Alliance. Theo explained that after Ragnar dismantled the corrupt Sarah's Merchant Guild, the Northern Territories were left without a major trade network. The floating archipelago, famous for its merchants, ports, and shipping expertise, was perfectly positioned to fill that massive economic gap. Before Antonio could protest that someone with blood on his hands wasn't worthy of such responsibility, Theo turned toward the gathered citizens instead. He wanted their opinion. Temple priest Marty was the first to step forward, speaking passionately about Antonio's sincerity and willingness to protect the people despite his past mistakes. One citizen raised a hand in support, then another. Before long, every surviving resident unanimously voted to recognize Antonio as their new leader. Though imperfect, he had risked everything to defend his homeland when it mattered most. With the people's blessing secured, Theo formally outlined the future partnership. The Northern Maritime Alliance would oversee trade, shipping, and the steady flow of goods throughout Ragnar's northern territories, helping restore prosperity after the chaos caused by the war. In return, Theo personally swore, under the honorable name of House Ragnar, that the floating archipelago's autonomy, security, and future would be protected. His promise wasn't empty political talk, it was a vow backed by Ragnar authority itself. Overcome with emotion, Antonio realized that every major turning point in his life had come because Theo chose to believe in him when no one else would. Speaking on behalf of the newly founded Maritime Alliance, Antonio pledged absolute cooperation and loyalty to House Ragnar. Their firm handshake symbolized more than a simple agreement. It marked the birth of an unbreakable alliance. Moments later, the earth trembled beneath everyone's feet as the massive islands finally settled perfectly into the northeastern coastline. Cheers erupted across the archipelago as the people celebrated the rebirth of their homeland. Far away from the celebrations, however, another survivor slowly clawed his way back to the surface. Theo's massive whirlpool had weakened with distance, allowing Newell to miraculously escape the crushing currents before they dragged him into the abyss forever. Half drowned and barely alive, the battered noble servitor finally reached a lonely stretch of land where he violently coughed seawater from his lungs. His shattered body wasn't what hurt the most. His pride had suffered a far deeper wound. Being humiliated by a young Ragnar successor was something Newell simply couldn't accept. Hatred consumed his every thought as he fantasized about tearing Theo apart piece by piece. Before he could recover any further, a familiar voice interrupted his rage. Looking up, Newell found Baradin standing above him, openly mocking the supposed strength of Troivin's elite noble servitors. His disappointment couldn't have been more obvious. Desperate to salvage both his dignity and the mission, Newell insisted that everything could still be fixed if Baradin simply lent him a hand. The tyrant dragon merely looked at him with amusement. From the very beginning, Baradin explained, he had never cared about helping Troivin seize the floating archipelago. His real objective was taking the entire landmass for himself. Cooperating with Troivin had merely been convenient entertainment. Once Theo relocated the archipelago, Baradin planned to present himself as the one reclaiming stolen territory, turning the whole situation into political capital. He even admitted he wouldn't have minded if Newell eliminated Theo along the way. Unfortunately, Baradin had made one mistake. He gave the servitor far more credit than he deserved. Despite all of Troivin's expensive enhancements, Newell couldn't even defeat a single young dragon of Ragnar. Humiliated beyond reason, Newell finally snapped, declaring that the era of Ragnar's 9 dragons had ended, and that the 9 noble servitors would soon surpass them all. He activated his final transformation. His arm grotesquely split apart as flesh and bone twisted together into a monstrous, organic blade. Before he could even finish his declaration, Baradin casually stepped forward. With one overwhelmingly powerful punch, he obliterated the entire upper half of Newell's body, reducing it to nothing more than a cloud of blood and mist. Looking down at the ruined servitor, the tyrant dragon scoffed in disappointment. Weaklings always wasted time talking instead of proving themselves through strength. Maybe the aging 9 dragons or even the ancient lizard they revered might struggle against Troivin's enhanced experiments. But Baradin wasn't like them. To him, Newell had never been anything more than a disposable pawn. After witnessing everything that unfolded, only one person truly captured the tyrant dragon's attention. Theo Ragnar had gone from being an interesting youngster to someone genuinely worthy of his interest, and that realization alone made Baradin smile. Far up in Ragnar's frozen northern front, the war was rapidly tilting in Troivin's favor. Under Ed Troivin's command, every skirmish felt predetermined before the first sword was even drawn. Ragnar's soldiers fought with everything they had, but one squad after another was overwhelmed, beaten and tied up as prisoners. Even in defeat, many refused to surrender their pride. They cursed the traitors for betraying House Ragnar until their final breaths. Ed had long since grown tired of hearing the same speeches about honor and loyalty. Without the slightest hint of emotion, he casually slipped the throats of the loudest prisoners before beheading them one after another. To him, they were nothing more than background noise. While overseeing the executions, a messenger hurried over with urgent news. The floating archipelago operation had completely collapsed and all communication with Newell had been lost. Moments later, another noble servitor stepped forward, wearing a metallic plague doctor mask. The first servitor, Ain, humbly apologized for Newell's failure, calling him nothing more than a defective disappointment. Ain acknowledged that losing the archipelago, their primary distribution hub, could heavily influence the future of the war and volunteered to personally correct the mistake. Ed, however, had no intention of chasing after the lost territory. To Ain's surprise, he calmly ordered the entire operation abandoned. While losing the floating archipelago would certainly hurt Troivin financially, they had already accumulated an enormous amount of wealth from exploiting its resources. There was no reason to let sunk costs distract them from the bigger picture. Instead, Ed commanded every remaining force to concentrate around the central battlefield, continuing the large-scale invasion exactly as planned. The fighting itself was merely bait, designed to keep Ragnar occupied. Their true objective had never changed. Every sacrifice, every battle, and every deception existed. Before we move ahead, please take a second to like on this video. A like tells me that you enjoyed this topic. Your support helps Amazing Apai grow naturally. For one purpose alone, the resurrection of the Med Dragon Emperor, nothing else mattered. Meanwhile, peace had finally returned to the newly relocated floating archipelago. Reconstruction progressed faster than anyone expected, as citizens enthusiastically rebuilt their homeland. The freshly established Northern Maritime Alliance inherited the transportation routes, once controlled by the corrupt Sarah's Merchant Guild, although they still hadn't received any response from the Southern Guild. Buried beneath an endless mountain of paperwork inside his office, Antonio Spinel looked completely exhausted. Thea casually walked in and immediately noticed the troubled expression on the Alliance leader's face. Thankfully, Theo pointed out that Ragnar's northern supply chain would actually become much easier to manage, now that the archipelago no longer drifted unpredictably across the sea. Transportation would finally become stable. Antonio appreciated the optimism, but admitted a different concern had been weighing on him. He wasn't afraid of logistics, he was afraid of Ragnar itself. Antonio openly confessed that while Theo had freed the floating archipelago from Troivan's oppression, he couldn't ignore reality. Nothing in the world came without a price. If Theo or House Ragnar ever changed their minds, the archipelago could simply exchange one master for another. Hesitating slightly, Antonio admitted he sometimes wondered whether they had actually been safer when they floated far away from everyone else. Theo understood exactly where those fears came from. In fact, he considered them healthy. Any responsible leader should constantly worry about protecting their people from outside control. However, Theo believed the opposite was true. Isolation had made the archipelago vulnerable, not safe, because no one expected invasions. They never developed the strength to defend themselves. Troivan's occupation exposed that weakness completely. A nation couldn't survive forever by depending on others to fight its battles. If the floating archipelago truly wanted lasting independence, it needed the power to protect itself. Theo already had the perfect solution. Drawing inspiration from Ragnar's legendary white armor dragon cavalry, he proposed building an elite force unique to the archipelago itself. Antonio immediately realized what Theo meant. The countless sea serpents surrounding the islands could become their equivalent of flying wyverns. The problem was obvious. Those monsters had spent generations terrorizing ships and smashing everything in sight. As if summoned by the conversation itself, reports suddenly came flooding in that several sea serpents had appeared near the harbor. Citizens instantly began evacuating, while guards scrambled to prepare for combat. Before panic could spread further, Theo calmly assured everyone there was nothing to fear. The serpents weren't enemies anymore. Welcoming the creatures with open arms, he explained that he intended to teach the people how to tame and ride them. Just as Ragnar possessed dragon riders soaring through the skies, the archipelago could create an order of elite sea serpent riders. The idea sounded absurd, nearly everyone present, until Theo reminded them of something hidden inside their own legends. Their beloved hero, Kriemhild, was always depicted fighting alongside a mighty sea serpent. Smiling, Theo suggested naming the future order the Kriemhildenite Order, as if to support the proposal. One particularly friendly sea serpent swam over and immediately took a liking to Antonio himself. While everyone watched the unbelievable interaction between citizens and sea serpents, a messenger arrived requesting Theo's presence. Inside one of the nearby dockside warehouses, he found Black Snow operative Cleve quietly sorting through stacks of confidential documents. She looked utterly exhausted, complaining that Theo had somehow accomplished more in a handful of days than entire intelligence divisions managed in months. Cleve revealed that Black Snow had already been secretly investigating the floating archipelago because they suspected it served as Troivan's hidden financial lifeline. Only the elite Nullsnow operatives were supposed to know about the mission, making Theo's accomplishments all the more unbelievable. That revelation immediately raised another question. If Black Snow already knew how important the archipelago was, why hadn't they acted sooner? Before Theo could ask, another figure casually walked into the warehouse. That massive man introduced himself as Baruan, though Ragnar knew him as one of its 9 dragons. Dante, Roll, the Tyrant Dragon. After hearing endless praise about Theo Ragnar from the other 9 dragons, Dante admitted he expected someone far more intimidating standing before him now. All he saw was a pretty-faced youngster. Theo instantly recognized the legendary powerhouse and respectfully greeted him. Cleve, meanwhile, looked thoroughly unimpressed. She had clearly expected Dante's arrival and immediately scolded him for allowing the archipelago situation to deteriorate without reporting any of it to Blacksnow. Theo quickly realized the tyrant dragon and Blacksnow had apparently been cooperating on some highly classified operation. Dante clearly didn't appreciate Cleve's attitude. Without warning, an overwhelming aura exploded throughout the warehouse. Neither Theo nor Cleve could remain standing. The crushing pressure forced both of them onto their knees, while every window in the building shattered from the sheer force. Theo had always known Dante was monstrously powerful, but experiencing that pressure firsthand completely changed his understanding. Suddenly, Ragnar's failure to reclaim the floating archipelago in his previous life made perfect sense. Despite looking like a wandering musclehead who forgot to wear shoes, Dante's strength was on an entirely different level. After torturing them long enough, the tyrant dragon suddenly burst into laughter, withdrew his aura, and casually claimed he had only been messing around. According to him, he simply forgot to report his observations while secretly monitoring Troven's activities. In Dante's opinion, the 9 dragons shouldn't waste time solving small problems immediately. It was more entertaining to let situations grow before crushing everything at once. Unfortunately for him, Theo had solved the entire problem before he even got the chance. Laughing heartily, Dante slapped Theo on the back so hard the young lord nearly collapsed. Despite his relaxed attitude, Theo knew the tyrant dragon was far more dangerous than he appeared. Dante rolled ranked among the strongest of Ragnar's 9 dragons and pursued power above everything else. In Theo's previous life, Dante somehow amassed extraordinary wealth, despite having no obvious source of income. Everything finally made sense. He must have secretly claimed the floating archipelago for himself in the original timeline. Realizing how dangerous this political monster truly was, Theo wisely chose to play along. He humbly apologized for unintentionally interfering with Dante's plans. Rather than becoming angry, hacking his hand, Theo still couldn't figure out what Dante genuinely wanted. Their meeting was interrupted when Cleve delivered Theo's newest orders. With the archipelago mission officially completed, every operative and soldier was to immediately reinforce Ragnar's central front against Troven. Dante approved without hesitation, insisting Theo belonged on the battlefield where real blood was being spilled. Before leaving, however, Dante asked one final question. His expression hardened as he asked whether Blacksnow's investigation orders had come directly from Robert Ragnar, the Black Dragon himself. Cleve confirmed they had. Smirking coldly, Dante instructed her to deliver a message. If Robert wanted answers, then the Black Dragon should stop hiding behind subordinates and come ask him personally. With that, Theo wasted no time and departed for the northern battlefield, ready to rejoin Ragnar's war against Troven. The fiercest fighting of the Central Plateau campaign had shifted to the Blade Mountain Range, where Ragnar and Troven armies clashed nonstop. Steel rang across the battlefield while explosions thundered overhead. Theo Ragnar wasted no time joining the war after arriving. Donning the white armored dragon cavalry uniform and mounting Umbra, he swept across the battlefield alongside his fellow dragon riders, tearing through Troven's vanguard with ruthless efficiency. Above the chaos, Captain Evelyn coordinated the assault. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to Amazing Apai. Subscribing makes sure you do not miss the next video, and it gives me motivation to keep improving the quality of every upload. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next one.